This is the History of Business Ethics by Eric Weckworth. In 1920, this is when we started seeing the first changes. Employees started asking for a living wage, which the standard back then was different. They wanted education and to provide a living for their family. That was considered a living wage back then. In 1930, they made a New Deal, well, which is the government that they passed a law they called the New Deal, and they got businesses to work with them to help raise family wages across the country. In 1950s, Harry Truman he expanded upon the New Deal and called it the Fair Deal, and he just added a bunch of stuff to the New Deal, and sent it on out the door as a new bill. Um, and he added a couple of things in there, like all these alphabet agencies, like the EPA, and social responsibility and stuff like that. And trying to get businesses to, um, you know, be more involved in the community and feel like they have an impact on the environment. 1937, the first book was published on both business ethics. It had 4 sections, and it covered fair treatment, fair prices, and more progress in business, and having fair service. So the 1960s, this is the birth of the anti-business trend. This decade saw a big rise in consumer protection all the way across the board. Yeah, so the latter half of the 60s, that's when they really started getting hit hard with consumer protection, specifically from 1965 up until about 1972. A lot of safety features were added to vehicles and labels added on to the packaging, like expiration dates and what was in the food. 1970, a lot of the businesses tried to focus on their public image and how they were perceived by the consumers. So in the 1980s, they developed the DII, the Defense Industry Initiative, and it helped to steer businesses away from having a stakeholder-centered approach on things. So the DII had 6 principles, and they all centered around companies providing ethical training to their employees and operating in an ethical manner. So we had the DII developed in the 80s, which helped companies regulate themselves, and you also had Reagan come into office in the 80s, and he lifted a lot of trade barriers and tariffs that were in place. Whenever Bill Clinton came into office, he kind of kept the whole self-regulation and free trade deal going. Tobacco companies came under the fire. They lost a lot of their advertising and vending machines in public places. They had their advertising in cartoons, so some of the cartoons got pulled. Tobacco just got hit hard in the 90s. He's also saw the FSGO federal sentencing guidelines passed, and this expanded upon the DII and increased the penalties for people, for corporations who broke laws, and it also gave corporations who broke laws a break if they didn't intend to. Because people make mistakes sometimes, so they ought not be punished as hard as people who do intentionally make these mistakes. So in 2001, Bush came into office, and he had to start cracking down on white collar crime because there's a lot of people fudging the books and falsifying financial reports, and it was so widespread he had to do something about it. So Congress passed improvements to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, similar to how Harry Truman did with the New Deal and the Fair Deal. Um, some of the improvements to Sarbanes-Oxley consisted of stiffening penalties for corporate fraud and making securities fraud a criminal offense. And they also established an accounting board, which made a code of ethics for financial reporting. Some other improvements to Sarbanes-Oxley was having the executives sign off on the firm's financial reports. What this did is, whenever they signed off on it, if the report was false, they could get slapped with a fine or be in prison or get both. So it just kind of depends on how Congress felt about it. Companies executives were required to disclose stock sales immediately, and it prohibited the company from giving loans to the top managers. Over the past 100 years, there's been a lot of change in the business ethics world. It's come a long way. Used to back in the 20s, they have kids crawling in frickin' machines, getting crushed, and nowadays, you can't get on the roof without a hard hat. So, there's been a lot of change. A lot of alphabet agencies have been created that weren't there before, and there's still people alive that 90 years ago, a lot of this stuff that we have nowadays wasn't in place, and they've seen all this stuff be implemented.